At 31 years old, Wren Calloway stood in the mud of a mountain street, with everything she owned bundled in a quilt at her feet, and no roof left in the world that would call itself hers. It was her late husband's own brother, Eli Calloway, who had put her out, standing on the porch of the cabin she had scrubbed and mended for 6 years, telling her the land had always been his, by right of blood, and that a widow with no sons had no claim on a dead man's ground. She had $9 sewn into the hem of her second petticoat, the whole of her fortune in the world, and when she heard that the county was auctioning off an old locked assay office for whatever anyone would pay just to be rid of it, she handed over 4 of those dollars without hardly stopping to think, because the price was absurd, and because something about the boarded windows and the rusted padlock called to her, the way a half-buried thing calls to a dog that has caught its scent. Her dog, a rust-colored hound named Copper, pressed against her skirts, as the crowd murmured that she'd bought herself a curse for $4 and a fool's pride, for no one in Larkspur Gulch had dared cross that threshold in 11 years. She told herself it was only lumber and stone, only a place to keep the rain off, only a roof bought cheap because folks were superstitious and she was desperate. She did not yet know that behind its silent walls waited a secret sealed away by a dead man's careful hands, a secret that would not only undo the ruin that had been done to her, but would set right a wrong that had been eating quietly at the whole of that town for 11 long years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Wren Calloway and her faithful dog Copper. If a story like this warms something in you, we'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight, and what it feels like to imagine starting over with nothing but a dog, a few coins, and a locked door. Wren had not been raised to expect ease, and she had not been raised to fear hard work either, and the two lessons together had shaped her more than any single sermon or scolding ever could. Her father, Silas Hartwell, had been a locksmith and a blacksmith both, in a river town in Missouri, a broad, quiet man, whose hands were always stained black at the knuckles, and who spoke rarely, but taught constantly, showing his daughter from the time she could hold a file, how a lock was not a mystery, but a conversation, how every tumbler had its own stubborn logic, how patience would open what force alone never could. Her mother had died delivering her, and so it was her father's world she grew up inside, the smell of coal smoke and hot iron, the ring of hammer on anvil, the particular silence of a man concentrating on work that could not be rushed. She learned to read a lock by feel before she learned to read a book by sight, and she learned, too, the deeper lesson her father wove into every lesson on metal and mechanism, that a thing left broken or shut away was not the same as a thing without worth, that value did not always announce itself, that the most overlooked object in a room might be the one holding everything together. When she was 19, a young miner named Thomas Calloway came through with a busted rifle lock that no one else in 3 counties could fix, and her father set her to the work while he watched, and by the time she had coaxed the mechanism back to life, Thomas Calloway had fallen in love with her steady hands and her unhurried patience, and within a year, she had married him and followed him west into the mountains, to a rough little settlement called Larkspur Gulch that had grown up fast and careless around a vein of silver ore. The town was not gentle, but Thomas was, and for a handful of years Wren built a life there that felt, if not easy, then at least honest, keeping their cabin at the edge of town, tending a garden that fought the thin mountain soil for every bean and turnip, and taking in odd repair work from neighbors who had heard, somehow, that the blacksmith's daughter had a gift for coaxing broken things back into service. It was in the second winter of her marriage that she found Copper, or rather, that Copper found her, a half-starved pup with a rust-colored coat and one ear that never stood quite right, shivering under the porch during a blizzard that had buried the town in 4 feet of snow. Thomas had wanted to leave the pup be, arguing they could barely feed themselves, let alone a stray dog. But Wren had already scooped him into her apron and was warming him by the stove before her husband finished his sentence, and Thomas, watching her, had simply laughed and said that arguing with his wife's soft heart was a fool's business he had learned to leave alone. Copper grew into a lean, watchful animal, with an uncanny nose, and a devotion to Wren that bordered on the sacred, following her step for step through her chores, sleeping across the threshold of whatever room she occupied, and greeting Thomas each evening with the same joyful, undignified enthusiasm, no matter how many times he came home smelling of mine dust and sweat. He learned the rhythms of the household, the way a good dog learns a family's heartbeat, positioning himself by the window when Wren baked so he could watch the road for Thomas's return, following her out to the garden each dawn to lie in the one patch of sun by the bean rows while she worked the stubborn soil, and settling always, without fail, at the foot of whatever chair held her at the end of a long day, as though his simple presence were a kind of anchor against whatever the mountain and its hard seasons might still ask of them. It was Thomas who used to say, half in jest, that Copper understood more of what Wren was feeling than he himself often did, and it was a joke that would come to hold more truth than either of them could have guessed, because the dog's devotion would prove in the end to be worth more than any fortune the mountain had ever surrendered. Those years taught Wren the values that would carry her through everything to come, that patience unlocked what impatience only jammed further shut, that a thing's worth was not always visible on its surface, and that loyalty, once earned, did not waver simply because circumstances turned hard. She did not know yet how thoroughly those lessons would be tested, nor how completely her father's old wisdom about locks and hidden mechanisms would return to her, years later and miles from that Missouri riverbank, in the form of a rusted padlock on an abandoned assay office that the whole town of Larkspur Gulch had learned to walk past without looking at directly. The fall, when it came the way mountain weather comes, sudden and total, though in truth, the danger had been building unseen for longer than Wren understood at the time. Thomas worked the deep shafts of the Rutledge Consolidated Mine, the largest and richest claim in the district, owned by a hard, immaculately dressed man named Cornelius Rutledge, who was seldom seen underground himself, but who set the pace, and the corners cut in every tunnel his men dug. There had been talk among the miners for months of timbering left too thin in the lower gallery, of the foreman pushing crews to chase a rich seam faster than the rock could safely bear, but Cornelius Rutledge answered every complaint with the same cold reminder that any man who found the work too slow to his liking was free to walk away from his wages. Thomas did not walk away, because Thomas had a wife and a mortgage of debt on tools and seed and winter coal, the same as every other man in that mine, and so he went down into the lower gallery on a gray October morning like any other, and the mountain, tired at last of being asked for more than it wished to give, closed over him along with 3 other men before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Wren's grief in the days that followed was a private, wordless thing, but the injury done to her afterward was public and deliberate. Cornelius Rutledge's company physician declared, with no examination Wren was ever permitted to witness, that the collapse had resulted from the miner's own negligence in ignoring posted safety notices, a claim every surviving man in that crew knew to be a lie, and on the strength of that declaration the company refused Wren the death benefit her husband's contract promised, a sum that would have kept her through the winter and beyond. She went to Rutledge's office herself, walked the long gravel path up to the grand house that overlooked the mineworks, and stood before his desk asking only for what was owed, and he had looked at her with the mild, untroubled courtesy of a man discussing weather, and told her that a company could not be expected to pay for a workingman's carelessness, and that she ought to be grateful he did not bill her late husband's estate for the cost of the rescue effort that had failed to bring his body up until the 3rd day. It was in that same terrible season that Eli Calloway, Thomas's older brother, arrived from the eastern part of the territory with a lawyer's letter, claiming the cabin, and the small parcel of land beneath it, had never truly passed to Thomas at all, but remained under an old family agreement in Eli's name, and though Wren suspected the paper was hastily drawn, and its claims dubious, she had neither the money nor the will left in her to fight a legal battle against her husband's own blood, while grief still sat raw in her chest. She packed what little was hers into a single quilt she folded and knotted at the corners the way her mother-in-law had once shown her, setting aside Thomas's good coat and the small tin box of his letters, though she had no notion yet of where either would find shelter. And she stood in the yard a long moment before she left, looking at the crooked fence posts Thomas had set with his own hands, and the bean rows Copper used to nap beside, memorizing it all the way a person memorizes a face they suspect they will not see again. Eli would not meet her eyes as his hired men carried the rest of it to a wagon bound for his own use, the good chairs and the quilting frame, and the little clock that had been a wedding gift, and Wren found she could not summon the anger such a theft should have deserved, only a bone-deep weariness that made the whole world feel thin and far away, as though she were watching someone else's ruin from a great distance. She walked into town that afternoon, with Copper pressed close against her leg the entire way, sensing, as he always seemed to sense, that something in his mistress had gone quiet and fragile and needed guarding, and with $9 sewn into her petticoat hem, the entire remainder of a marriage and a life she had built with her own 2 hands. It was 3 days later, standing outside the county land office reading a notice pinned to the board, announcing a tax auction of abandoned town properties, that Wren first heard the words that would change everything, spoken low and uneasy by 2 men beside her. The old Assay office, they said, the one that had stood locked and untouched since Silas Crane vanished 11 years back, was finally going up for sale, because the county clerk had grown tired of carrying a derelict building on the books that not even squatters would touch. She recognized the name Crane only vaguely, from the kind of story told to frighten children away from empty buildings. A tale of a disgraced assayer who had stolen gold from the mine and fled or been killed for his crime, no one seemed entirely certain which, and whose office had stood sealed ever since because, the old-timers claimed, something in there was cursed, or haunted, or simply too shameful to disturb. Wren, who had grown up in a house where locked things were puzzles rather than omens, felt something in her stir at the mention of it, a curiosity sharpened rather than dulled by the town's evident dread, and when the auction was called 2 days later, and no one but her raised a hand at even the opening bid, she stepped forward with 4 of her 9 remaining dollars, and bought the whole sorry, shunned little building outright, while the small gathered crowd exchanged glances that told her plainly she had just proven herself either braver or more foolish than any of them. The Assay office sat at the ragged edge of town, where the last buildings gave way to sage and stone, a squat structure of gray clapboard, with a stone chimney, and windows boarded so long the wood had silvered and split. And when Wren finally worked the ancient padlock free with a set of picks her father had taught her to make with her own hands, the door groaned open on hinges that had not turned in over a decade, releasing a breath of stale, dust-thick air that smelled of cold ash and old paper. Copper did not wait for an invitation. He pushed past her skirts the moment the gap was wide enough, nose low, tail flagging with the particular seriousness he showed only when something had genuinely caught his attention, and made straight for the wide stone hearth at the far end of the single room, where he began scratching insistently at the floorboards just before it, and whining low in his throat in a way Wren had heard him do exactly twice before in his life, both times when he had found something buried that mattered. She lit a lamp against the gathering dusk, and knelt beside him more out of habit than expectation, running her hand along the seam where hearthstone met floor, and felt beneath her fingers the telltale unevenness of wood that had been cut and refitted by a careful hand, a seam so nearly invisible that only someone trained, as she had been trained, to feel for the deliberate imperfections of a hidden mechanism would ever have noticed it at all. Whatever waited behind that hearth, she understood in that moment, with a certainty that raised the hair on her arms, had been hidden not by accident, but by design, sealed away by someone who had wanted it found only by the right hands, or perhaps not found at all, and Copper's insistent scratching told her plainly that whatever it was, it mattered. It took her the better part of 2 evenings, working by lamplight after her days spent scrubbing linens for the town's one boarding house, in exchange for a bit of bread and coin, to work the hidden panel free, without splintering the careful joinery someone had labored over so long ago, and when at last the section of hearthstone facing swung outward on a pivot no wider than a hand, she found herself looking into a shallow cavity that had been lined with oiled canvas to keep the damp out, holding a leather satchel gone stiff with age, a bundle of ledgers bound in twine, and a small iron strongbox, whose lock, when she finally coaxed it open with the same patient hands her father had trained, revealed a modest but unmistakable weight of raw gold dust wrapped in cloth, more money sitting in that dim little room than Wren had seen in the whole of her married life. But it was the ledgers, not the gold, that told her the true shape of what she had found, for they were assay records in a careful cramped hand, recording weight after weight of gold ore brought up from the Rutledge Consolidated Mine over the course of nearly 2 years, and beside each official recorded weight, in a second column marked only with the initials SC, a second true weight, always higher, sometimes by a startling margin, than the figure that had gone into the company's own books. Tucked among the ledgers was a letter, unfinished, addressed to the Territorial Mining Commissioner, in which Silas Crane, the vanished assayer, had begun to lay out in plain, careful language his discovery that Cornelius Rutledge had for years been systematically under-recording the gold his own mine produced, paying his miners on the false lower figure, while pocketing the difference between what was dug and what was declared, a fraud that had quietly robbed every man who worked that mine, and every family who depended on his wages, of money that was rightfully theirs. The letter broke off mid-sentence, as though its author had been interrupted and never returned to finish it, and Wren sat alone in the lamplight with Copper's head heavy against her knee, understanding all at once that the town's cursed shunned assayer had not been a thief at all, but a man who had discovered a theft, and who had paid for that discovery with his freedom, or very likely with his life, and had hidden the proof and a portion of the stolen gold in the one place he trusted no dishonest hand would think to look, because no one in Larkspur Gulch had dared open that door in 11 years. She spent the better part of that night simply sitting with what she had found, the lamp burning low and the mountain wind working at the shutters, running her fingers over Crane's careful, cramped handwriting, and trying to imagine the man himself, hunched at this same hearth long after the town had gone dark, weighing gold by lamplight, and slowly coming to understand the shape of the wrong he had stumbled into. Copper, unsettled by her stillness, rose twice in the night, to press his nose against the reopened panel, as though making certain whatever had been hidden there, remained exactly where it belonged, and Wren found a strange comfort in his vigilance, as though the dog understood, in whatever wordless way dogs understand such things, that the papers in her lap were not merely old and interesting but dangerous, the kind of truth that men had already once been willing to silence a life to bury. When dawn finally came pale and cold through the gaps in the boarded windows, she wrapped the ledgers and the unfinished letter back in their oiled canvas, with hands that had gone stiff from the night's chill, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like her father's voice in her ear, that a lock, once opened, cannot honestly be closed again, and that whatever came next, she owed it to Silas Crane, and to every miner whose wages had quietly vanished into Cornelius Rutledge's ledgers, to see the truth all the way through. The days that followed the discovery brought no peace, only a slow gathering of storm. Wren was cautious enough not to speak openly of what she had found, understanding instinctively that a secret of such weight, in a town still ruled in every practical sense by Cornelius Rutledge's money and influence, was safer kept close, until she understood the shape of the danger it carried. But caution in a small town is a leaky vessel, and word travels along channels no one intends to open. It began with the boarding-house keeper's wife remarking that the widow Calloway had been seen carrying strange old papers, and grew, as such things do, into a rumor that she had found Crane's stolen gold outright, until within a fortnight, a visitor arrived at the assay office, whom Wren recognized at once from that terrible afternoon, in the grand house on the hill. Not Cornelius Rutledge himself, but his son and business manager. a smooth, watchful young man named Harlan Rutledge, who came with an offer to purchase the building and its contents, sight unseen, for a sum considerably more generous than $4, framed as an act of family charity toward a poor widow burdened with a haunted property. Wren, who had learned patience from a lock and courage from losing everything she loved, declined politely and firmly, and watched Harlan Rutledge's easy smile thin at the edges as he left, understanding as clearly as she did that his offer had been a test, and that she had failed it in exactly the way that worried him most. The pressure mounted from more than one direction at once, for it was around this same time that Eli Calloway, hearing that his brother's widow had somehow come into money and a piece of property with a story attached to it, arrived unannounced, to claim that the old Assay office stood partly on land his family agreement covered, a claim as thin and hastily constructed as the one that had taken her cabin, and Wren found herself standing once more before a man determined to take from her what little she had managed to build back. But this time she was not the same woman who had packed her quilt in silent grief and walked away without a fight. She had spent her evenings with old ledgers and a dead man's careful hand, and she understood now the particular power of documentation kept honest and complete, and she told Eli plainly, with Copper standing stiff-legged and low-growling at her side in a way he had never done before in his life, that she had witnesses to the auction, a bill of sale from the county clerk, and no intention whatsoever of surrendering property she had rightfully bought. Copper's uncharacteristic hostility toward Eli, a man he had known and tolerated for years, seemed to Wren less like temper and more like judgment, the dog's steady nature reading something false in the man's bearing that she herself had only begun to suspect. Word soon reached her, through the same boarding-house gossip that had betrayed her secret in the first place, that Harlan Rutledge and Eli Calloway had been seen together at the saloon, heads bent close in conversation over a bottle neither man seemed in any hurry to finish, and Wren understood then that the two threats pressing against her were not separate at all, but had found each other, two men with reasons of their own to see the widow Calloway driven quietly out of town before she could make trouble for anyone. She took to sleeping lightly after that, with Copper stationed by the door, rather than at the foot of her cot, and she spent her evenings not only guarding the ledgers, but copying portions of them by hand into a second notebook she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard of her own choosing in the boarding-house room she now rented. Reasoning, with her father's old caution about never trusting a single lock to hold everything of value, that if the originals were ever seized or destroyed, the truth itself would still survive in her own careful handwriting. The trouble came to a head on a night when Wren woke to Copper's frantic barking and the smell of coal oil, finding two men, attempting to force the Assay office's rebuilt lock, while a third stood watch with a lantern turned low, and though the men fled into the dark, the moment Copper's barking roused the neighboring households, the message was unmistakable: someone wanted either the papers destroyed, or Wren frightened enough to abandon the building, and everything hidden within it. It was Copper again, sniffing along the porch the next morning, who found the dropped signet ring near the doorstep, a heavy piece of gold engraving stamped with the letter R, and holding that small cold piece of evidence in her palm, Wren felt the last of her hesitation burn away into something harder and more purposeful, a resolve that the wrong done to Silas Crane 11 years before, and the wrong done to every miner whose pay had been quietly shorted since, and the wrong done to her own husband, and every family who had ever trusted Cornelius Rutledge's mind to deal honestly with them, was not going to be allowed to stand, simply because the man responsible was rich and comfortable, and accustomed to being obeyed. Wren did not go to Cornelius Rutledge, and she did not go to the sheriff, whom she suspected too closely tied to Rutledge's patronage to act against him, without overwhelming cause. Instead she went, on a cold clear morning, with the ledgers wrapped carefully in oilcloth, and Copper trotting at her heel, to the Territorial Mining Commissioner's traveling deputy, who happened by great good fortune to be passing through Larkspur Gulch that very week on his regular circuit, and she laid before him Silas Crane's unfinished letter, the careful double-columned ledgers recording true weights against false, and the small strongbox of gold, whose provenance the ledgers explained beyond any reasonable doubt. The deputy, a methodical man named Overton, who had seen a great many false claims, and recognized immediately that this was not one of them, spent 2 full days verifying the handwriting against Crane's known assay reports still on file at the county office, cross-checking the recorded weights against surviving company shipment manifests, and interviewing 3 former miners, all now scattered to other camps, who confirmed under careful questioning that they had always suspected their pay came up short, but had never possessed proof enough to challenge a man as powerful as Cornelius Rutledge. When Overton finally rode up the gravel path to the grand house on the hill with a formal notice of investigation in hand, the whole town seemed to hold its breath, and Wren, watching from the boarding-house porch with Copper's head resting against her boot, understood that whatever came next would either vindicate everything Silas Crane had sacrificed, or bury it forever alongside him. What came next was neither quick nor entirely clean, for men like Cornelius Rutledge do not surrender their standing without a fight, and he spent a furious week attempting to discredit the ledgers as forgeries, and Wren herself as an opportunist, preying on an old town legend for personal gain, a story Harlan Rutledge repeated to anyone in the saloon willing to listen. But the truth, once it has a foothold, has a way of gathering its own weight, and the surviving miners Overton had interviewed began, one by one, to come forward publicly once they saw that someone with real authority was finally willing to listen, each new voice adding its own small confirming detail, until the accumulated testimony could no longer be waved away as one widow's fancy. The final and most damning proof arrived almost by accident, when the county clerk, searching old records at Overton's request, discovered a sealed complaint Silas Crane had filed 11 years earlier, buried and never acted upon, formally accusing Cornelius Rutledge of gold fraud, in language that matched the unfinished letter found in the hidden cavity, almost word for word. Proof beyond any remaining doubt that Crane had not vanished as a thief fleeing justice, but had disappeared in the very act of trying to secure it, likely silenced by the same man he had dared to accuse. Faced with a mounting weight of testimony, documents, and an official complaint the mining commissioner could no longer pretend had never existed, Cornelius Rutledge's carefully built authority in Larkspur Gulch collapsed within the span of a single difficult month. His mine placed under formal investigation, his accounts frozen pending a full audit, and Harlan Rutledge, whose signet ring Copper had found upon the assay office porch, quietly departing the territory ahead of a warrant, before anyone could compel him to answer for the attempted arson. The restoration, when it came, was not Wren's alone to claim, and she made certain from the first that it never became so, for the gold in that small iron strongbox, and whatever settlement eventually emerged from Rutledge's frozen accounts belonged, in every sense that mattered to her, to the miners and widows the fraud had actually harmed. She worked with Deputy Overton and the county clerk to see a portion of the recovered gold and the eventual restitution, ordered by the mining commissioner, distributed among the families of men who had worked the Rutledge Consolidated Mine over the years of proven fraud, including, at last, the death benefit that had been wrongfully denied her own household, and when the ledger of names was drawn up for that distribution, she asked that her own name be listed last, and no larger than any other. The town, which had spent 11 years walking past a locked door out of superstition and fear, now walked past it with something closer to reverence, and it was the county itself that proposed, once the investigation closed and Rutledge's guilt stood established beyond dispute, that the old assay office be formally renamed in honor of the man who had died protecting the truth inside it, so that the small stone building at the edge of town became, and remained ever after, the Crane Assay House, no longer a place folks hurried past with lowered eyes, but a place children were told to remember, because it proved that even a shunned and shuttered door might be hiding not a curse, but a kindness, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to open it. On the day the new sign was hung above the door, hand-lettered by the school teacher and nailed up by two of the very miners whose fathers had been shorted years before, the whole town turned out in a way it had never once gathered for Wren in all her years of quiet grief. And she stood at the edge of the small crowd with Copper leaning warm against her leg, watching people she barely knew touch the freshly painted letters of a dead man's name, as though greeting an old friend finally come home, and she understood that this, more than any coin ever paid to her, was the true weight of what had been recovered. Eli Calloway's claim on the property, thin as it always had been, evaporated entirely once the town's sympathies turned so firmly against anyone who had stood near the Rutledge name, and he left Larkspur Gulch before the season turned, taking his lawyer's letter and his borrowed authority with him, while Wren remained, no longer a widow with nothing but a bundled quilt and $9, but a woman known now throughout the district as the one who had trusted a dog's instinct and her own father's patient teaching over a whole town's fear, and who had proven, in doing so, that the truth does not require a grand stage to matter, only someone willing enough to kneel down and listen when a faithful nose points toward a floorboard that does not quite lie flat. It is worth remembering, now that Wren Calloway's story has been told from its beginning to its end, that everything which changed the fortunes of an entire town began with a woman who had already lost her husband, her home, and very nearly her hope, choosing to spend 4 of her last $9 on a building that no one else would touch. It began, too, with a dog who trusted his own instincts enough to scratch at a floor that looked, to every other eye, like nothing more than ordinary boards, and with the plain, unglamorous virtue Wren's father had spent a childhood teaching her. That value is so often hidden precisely where fear has taught people not to look, and that patience, not force, is what finally opens the doors that matter. Silas Crane had waited 11 years in whatever quiet resting place the mountain had given him, for someone honest enough to find what he had hidden, and brave enough to finish what he had started. And it was a resourceful widow, with a rust-colored hound, who finally did both, proving that overlooked things, whether they be old buildings, forgotten men, or women the world has decided to write off, are so very often worth far more than the price anyone was ever willing to pay for them. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Wren and Copper tonight. If their story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that quiet patience can outlast even the loudest injustice, and we would love to know, in your own words, what you think you might have done in Wren's place, standing before that locked door with only $4 and a curious dog to guide you. Until next time, stay close.